Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you all for still being here. I know it's been like a really long 3 days, and I appreciate you staying all the way to the last spot just for me. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm Carolyn, and I work at Blacklane. I'm also a Mozilla tech speaker. I'm also based in Berlin, like everyone else here that isn't from Vienna. And before all of that, though, I was working as a technical writer. So I've always been really interested in how we learn new technologies, and maybe more importantly, how we're teaching these emerging technologies. And also, before we get started, I want to mention that when I say tooling, I'm using it very, 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 very generally. Like, for the purpose of this talk, tooling will encompass everything that relates to our code and that is supposed to improve our developer experience on the front end. So think like type systems, static site generators, etc. So sometimes I get overwhelmed by all of this tooling that's both like available to us as front-end developers and also that I frequently see talked about within our communities. And a couple months ago, I was feeling particularly down about all the technologies that I don't know and I will probably never know. And so like any time that I feel slightly inadequate, I turn to Twitter for validation. And I asked front-end developers, what are some tools, technologies, buzzwords that people describe as simple or easy to pick up, but you just still don't really get? And I found out that I wasn't alone in this. Like hundreds of people replied or privately messaged me to tell me about their struggles. So I gathered all of these answers, and for the first part of this talk, I want to touch on the top 5 most frequent answers I received. And a fair warning is that I will talk about my personal experiences with these technologies throughout this, and so there's a very good chance that your experience is probably and definitely different. Also, spoiler alert, I won't be talking about Webpack, even though that was a very popular answer. Because frankly, the people who say that Webpack are easy are the same people who say that they don't talk shit about their past employers, aka they're liars. Anyway, I want to start with TypeScript because selfishly, this is what I'm learning right now at work and really struggling with. And according to the website, TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript that compiles to plain JavaScript. When I was confused by reading this, people just told me, it's just some types on your JavaScript, or it's just like Flow, but better. Both of which really aren't that helpful to explain to a beginner. I would argue that TypeScript is a whole new language. Maybe if you already know a strong, explicit, statically typed programming language, it's less of a stretch. But if you're only familiar with JavaScript, it is pretty different from what you might be used to. It also has its own compiler. That's not easy. Not to mention things like import star as React from React. Why does that exist? Or vague errors that happen because the documentation never mentions that an empty array without type annotations is type never by default. And so you have to dig through the issue responses on the TypeScript repo just to find that out. Cool. And finally, there are just so many different file extensions. What do they even do? I don't really know. All right, next I want to take a beat and talk about Redux. So on their docs, they are described as a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. When I was first learning Redux, I literally Googled, why is Redux so confusing? And there was actually a Quora topic with the exact same title. So naturally, I clicked, and one of the top advices for learning Redux was, I think the best way to learn Redux is to forget trying to understand it. What? After that, I asked my colleagues, because I was like, oh, okay, I don't really get it. And one of them sent me the Elm architecture documentation, because apparently Redux is based on Elm. And that has to be, if you're sending any sort of architecture documentation, it is sort of elite, in my opinion. But, it can't be that simple, really. There's also some concepts that take a bit of getting used to, like understanding the unidirectional flow. You'll have to navigate your way through a lot of specific jargon, like action, async action, action creator, store enhancer. You get my point, they all sound the same. Fortunately, the Redux docs team is really committed to making things better, so they have a glossary, but still. And finally, all of the middleware that makes it really confusing. So think like thunks and saga and really anything async related. It's rough. Moving on, GraphQL. I actually have an entire talk about how I think that GraphQL is difficult to learn that I gave at GraphQL Finland a few months ago. I think I was on this exact same stage in probably the same outfit, so I won't really linger on this one too much. But when I talk to people about GraphQL, I hear a lot of things like, I use it, but I don't get it. Or, I feel like I know it, but I also know that I don't. And this is understandable, especially when you're first learning and people are saying things to you like, it's kind of like JSON, but not really. It's kind of like types, but not really. And finally, it's kind of like string interpolation, but not really. And I'm done, but it's difficult to wrap up this concept in one sentence. Also, the name is confusing, particularly the graph part. For the longest time, I thought that GraphQL, I just kind of figured it was, like D3 or a programming language that makes charts because, spoiler alert, it's not. But it's not that difficult of a conclusion to draw if those are the only graphs that you know. And speaking of GraphQL, let's talk about Gatsby. Gatsby's gotten a lot of love this conference. And generally, I've heard many people describe it as the easiest way to make a static website in React. Yeah. OK, I'll give Gatsby credit, though. It is beginner-friendly if you already feel proficient and confident with React, or if you understand and can use GraphQL. Or if you want to build something that's relatively small and not super custom. But even this doesn't necessarily guarantee you success. Gatsby has a lot of magic under the hood that, at least from my perception, not a lot of people seem sure about or can really confidently explain. But luckily, if you get stuck on something, you can just delete the cache folder. I'm just kidding. But actually, it does kind of solve a lot of problems. Like many of the technologies I mentioned, the Gatsby team is, committed to making things better. They've been working on their error descriptions and the documentation, which I personally appreciate. The last of the 5 answers I received was Flexbox, or some sort of combination of Flexbox, Grid, and CSS. All I can say is that I get it. Pretty much any time I have a ticket that has to do with Flexbox, I end up going through all 24 levels of Flexbox Froggy. But can you blame me? Really? All the properties sound the same. There's align items, align content, justify content, flex wrap, flex flow, flex direction. They all sound the same. And if you're like me and you never properly learn this terminology, you're probably very familiar with this page. It's the complete guide to Flexbox by CSS Tricks. And apparently, rumor has it that this page actually has more views than the actual home page of CSS Tricks. So you're not alone. And I know I said 5, but because we're at a React conference, I needed to add that I personally don't think React is as intuitive as everyone claims. Between component life cycles and JSX, let's just say it was a much further stretch from vanilla JavaScript than I was expecting. And there were a lot of tears when it was introduced during my boot camp, mostly from me, but a few other people too. So honestly, my original plan for this talk was to just continue like this for 30 minutes. We could talk about all sorts of technologies. We can do it at the after party if you want. If you get a few beers, it's even better. But I thought about it, and I don't think this would be really fair to us, because this issue is far bigger than front-end or front-end tooling. It's actually tech in general. My very first job in the tech industry was to create materials that would basically explain blockchain to artists. And my bosses were always very confused that we had to continually iterate over these, core concepts of blockchain to these artists who do not work with technology. And at the time, me as a non-technical person, I was equally as confused by my boss's confusion. Blockchain was still fairly new, and overall, I don't think I'd ever use the word simple to describe it. And fast forward a few years, and I'm watching a talk online by Jim Fisher titled "Don't Say Simply" at Write the Docs London. Towards the end, he discusses why we do it, why we describe things. We continually use these words simply and describe things this way, even if it's not necessarily appropriate for the situation. And he makes a very important distinction that, for me, kind of put this all into perspective. We mistake familiarity for simplicity. And seriously, I heard this and I was like, oh my God, the stars have aligned, my mind is blown, this is amazing. We mistake familiarity for simplicity. Now, Jim talks about this in the context of technical writing. So you work for hours and hours, week after week, to build this product or this feature, and you become super familiar with it to the point that you don't even cognitively recognize the core concepts as you're working with them. And then we forget that those concepts aren't necessarily universal. So then when we go to document the product, we forget to take that extra step back. And I think this same logic can apply for technologies that we learn. Think about how much time you spend going through a React course or working your way through a TypeScript tutorial or building small projects on the side to learn something new. Then that's even before diving into the code base that you're probably learning it for. And then once you're in that code base, you spend hours and hours being frustrated over these vague errors and failing tests. But then, once you finally make it through and you start to feel a little good, you're just like, oh yeah, this is simple. It's fine. Another thought I had throughout this entire experience of tweeting and hearing everyone's responses was wow, if so many people feel the same way, why aren't we talking about this more often? And at the risk of sounding like I'm doing some sort of school presentation, there's actually a political and mass communication theory that describes this pretty well. It's called the spiral of silence, and it proposes that people have a fear of isolation. And this fear of isolation comes from the idea that the social group that they're in our case, the tech community, might isolate, neglect, or exclude members if they voice certain opinions. So they don't. They stay silent. And I see this a lot in our industry, and I can even feel myself doing it fairly often. I'll scroll past a conversation on Twitter, and it'll be two people talking about onboarding a teammate to a Redux project, for example. And in the replies, it'll be like, why do you even need an onboarding? Just give them an afternoon and a link to the docs. And all of me wants to respond, I really want to say something, but I won't. And I know many others who wouldn't either. But the thing with this spiral of silence, though, is that there's an important point to it. The assessment of one's social environment may not always correlate with the reality. And I believe that this is our case in the tech industry. So how can we bridge that gap between our perceived reality and our own lived experiences? And I think the answer is empathy. And okay, before you roll your eyes and kind of glaze over, let me explain. So empathy is a cool thing, and it is. And It's a cool thing because we can leverage it because it's naturally hardwired into our brains. And while yes, like I think we should all, be able to be a little bit more aware that all the people around us are full humans, etc. But this isn't necessarily what this is about. I'm calling for increased empathy, but I want to focus on how we can translate that empathy into action. That way that we can become better teachers for the people that we're working with directly, as well as better mentors for the community that we're in. Because empathy matters more in these educational contexts. In our case, as developers, this typically means mentoring and training new colleagues as they learn required skills for our code base. And studies show that these folks will learn faster, better, and last longer if empathy drives that learning. But the thing is, empathy also requires humility, which is a trait that we don't necessarily have an abundance of in our industry all the time. By truly having to see the world the way someone else does, you have to acknowledge that your perspective, oh my gosh, that was a hard word. Okay. Your perspective is not the only one. And so if it was easy for you to learn, that's great. But it's not necessarily the only experience. There are concrete steps that you can take to cultivate empathy if it's something that doesn't come naturally to you. I won't necessarily dive into these now. I'm happy to talk about it later. But I do want to give some suggestions for creating more productive, supportive spaces. We can start by taking ownership of the communities that we're already involved in. Particularly, we can work to foster supportive spaces within the organizations we work in. One that will give people the confidence that can combat this spiral of silence. I always think about how awkwardly I feel when I'm in some sort of like dance-related exercise course, for example. For context, I can't dance. I have like zero rhythm. And I might feel like I'm totally in shape, like I'm very active, I can do a group exercise, but add in any sort of element that I don't feel confident doing or any steps that I don't know, and it instantly becomes hard and potentially demoralizing. And I feel very similar when I'm coding. And it feels like this because when we're learning something new and you're struggling, like emotions are inevitable. They're gonna happen. And these emotions live in like the most primitive parts of our brains and make it significantly harder to like rationally assess the situations that we're in. So there's a lot of comfort in acknowledging these emotions because it helps calm that like primitive part of our brain, and our rational brain can see the situation a little differently. That's why if we're in an environment that's caring, respectful, and positive, and we're surrounded by people who are cheering us on and saying like, you can do it, no worries, we all screw up, here's the next step. All of a sudden, the learning is exciting and fun, and we want to keep going. Another thing I found especially helpful at the company I'm at right now is that we have an internal mentorship program that we started last summer. Everyone in engineering was paired with a mentor, and you have regular one-on-ones with this person. And this person should ideally be someone whose work you admire, and it doesn't have to be someone from the same discipline as you, like mine is a back-end developer, for example. It should also be someone who you maybe are already having candid conversations with, or you could imagine having these sorts of conversations with, and not your direct line manager. What I personally found is that having these one-on-ones be sort of like a safe place where I am able and even encouraged to let my feelings out without any judgment helps me stay in control of those feelings and not become like consumed by these negative like self-doubting thoughts. Also, okay, so maybe those things sound nice, like I get it, but it's not necessarily something that you can use and make a difference with tomorrow or on Monday. So I want to give you a few more pragmatic examples. Even if you're not a formal mentor, we can all practice teaching with empathy. As I mentioned earlier, learning more complex things often comes with this emotional component. And many of us, when people come to us and have these kind of emotions, we tend to kind of like ignore it or work around it and try to find solutions. And what we miss is that this person who's coming to seek advice from us might be looking as much for empathy and validation as for a solution. And what we can do is like relate back to our own experiences. And if you're not sure how to talk about this, you can try using the feel, felt, found structure, which means I can see that you feel and acknowledge their frustrations, emotions, etc. I have felt that way when, and give a concrete example. It doesn't have to be the same example, same technology, but it should be something that you can correlate an actionable takeaway from. And then say, what I have found is that, and offer something to them, a resource, learning tactic, validation, your choice. What we can also do is ban isolating words like easy, simple, obviously, from our vocabulary. And this is already a common practice in technical writing, but it hasn't really expanded beyond documentation, really. But we can learn a lot from these practices, and we can learn to be mindful about the word choice that we are using. If you're struggling to find alternatives, Jim Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, has some suggestions. We can be more specific. Maybe a particular static site generator is easy because it's quick to set up or doesn't have much custom configuration. If that's the case, then just say so. Or you can be comparative. Something is smaller than something else. Your state management alternative requires less middleware for async actions than Redux. Or your CSS solution has fewer properties names to learn than Flexbox. You can also be absolute. It takes 5 lines of code to integrate this into your project. Or here's a link to a specific tutorial that I found useful. And when you suggest being absolute, a lot of people jump to time, and that's what you see in a lot of marketing materials, like to show how easy something is, like, oh, launch a website in 10 minutes, build a server from scratch in 30 seconds, like, I don't know. In this case, I would recommend that you show and not tell, and if you really think something takes 5 minutes, really take the time to make a video of yourself doing it and try to see if that's really the case, because more than likely, it's probably not. We can also, when we think something is easy, we can deconstruct why we think it is easy and why it might have been easy for us while we were learning. So take our Gatsby example from earlier. Like perhaps maybe when you were learning Gatsby, you already knew React, you knew GraphQL, but the person you're talking to is missing one of those pieces. This will help you give them better recommendations and more specific areas to go for their learning. And finally, you can keep a journal while you're learning something new. And it doesn't have to be anything super deep. I don't have to write paragraphs, but even just a weekly list, bulleted list of one thing you learned, one thing you struggled with, and then any helpful resources. That way, when you're onboarding a new colleague or a friend or something to this new technology, you can give sincere, empathetic suggestions. Now, hopefully I've given you something that you can use when you leave this conference and convince your team to implement some technology you heard about the past couple of days. And I'll just leave you with some final thoughts. Just because you understand something doesn't mean that everyone else will. People learn at different rates, and this applies for programming, but also things outside of programming. For example, I can hard-boil an egg, and I have no clue how to fry one. And anytime I've tried, I've failed, even though people say it's really, really easy. But Sarah, our MC, for example, it's the opposite. She can fry an egg, but not necessarily boil one. Fun fact. Brains are weird. That's just how it is. And seriously, if it's eggs or JavaScript frameworks, what we need to remember is that no matter how intuitive you think your tool is, everyone starts somewhere, and everyone is a beginner at some point. And it's okay that things are hard, and it's okay if we say that these things are difficult to learn. Programming's hard. I'll just like throw that out there. But chances are, you're probably doing better than you think. And before I leave the stage, I want to end on a quote from Joe Frank, which I think sums up the past 24 minutes in 2 sentences. In one of her talks, she said that by saying something is easy, you remove the accomplishment of learning something as it was always supposed to be easy, and learning something is always an accomplishment. Thank you.